mobilize. So we did at one time pick up and go out and live in tents for 3 days. And it was an exercise, and it was kind of fun. We did have 2 medical problems occurred while we were there. One was one of our helicopters was taking a pregnant woman who was to Seoul to get delivered and had mechanical problems, and so actually landed where we were. So our surgeons delivered a baby. That was the first one. The second, a general came by to see how we were doing, and while he was there, he decided he needed to be treated for his non-specific urethritis. And this is actually, we're administering the VD test. They had to take it twice a year, educational program. And this is a sample question. If you think you have VD, what should you do? A, volunteer for extra physical training and take cold showers. B, cry. C, locate your contact and demonstrate your displeasure. D, go to a Korean doctor and take Chinese medicine. E, go to sick call. In the movie, Hawkeye and Trapper get sent to Japan for temporary duty. I got sent to Camp Ames for temporary duty. Their doctor rotated out, didn't have a replacement. So I was sent to Camp Ames, which is sort of in the middle of the south third of the country. And it was the base where all our nuclear weapons were brought into the country, maintained, and worked on if there were problems. Now, of course, we had no nuclear weapons in Korea in 1973 and 4, but that's where I was stationed for 6 weeks. And I really felt like an outsider because other than the dentist and I, everybody else that worked there was either an MP or a nuclear weapons specialist. So we really didn't have, only had one person to talk to. I was scared to death, especially on Tuesday mornings, because at 10 to 10, every Tuesday morning, an F-111 would come in at about 200 feet, roaring and blasting. And I learned that he would say a code word, and if somebody on our base who was at the radio didn't give him the right code word back, he was going to blow us up. This was a drill in case the North Koreans infiltrated and took over the space. So it was a little interesting on Tuesday mornings. It was just a little different buzz in the air, and watch this guy come in and yes. I had to treat a German Shepherd twice. First time he got in a fight with another dog, or she got in a fight with another dog and ended up with a big laceration in the scalp and a split eyelid. The handler said he'd talked to the vet and soul, and the vet and soul said I could sew him up. Thank you, vet and soul. Now, I knew how to sew things up. A German Shepherd, he's got his muzzle on, he's on the table, and he's and I did sew him up successfully, even the eyelid. That was interesting. And except just as I finished, I heard this. The trainer fainted. He hit his head on the linoleum floor. So I had to end up treating him for a closed head injury. 3 weeks later, the same trainer comes in and he says, I've got some work for you. That same dog, you know, he attacked a chainmail fence and broke an incisor. And the dentist says he'll do a root canal on the dog if you'll do the anesthesia, and the vet and soul says you can do it. So, met my friend, the German Shepherd, gave her a shot, and she fell asleep. We started an IV, dripped in more anesthesia, put her in the dental chair, and the dentist did a root canal on this dog. I almost died there because one Sunday I decided to walk the perimeter. It was 16 miles around and it didn't take any water. And it was a very hot and humid day. Another person made the same mistake. We did make it, but we were really dehydrated. And I almost killed a Korean soldier. This was a publication in Daejeon, which was the community closest to where Camp Ames was. And I was sent a translation of it. The headline was, "A military doctor saved a Korean soldier." A Korean soldier got bit by a poisonous snake while he was performing field exercise and was hospitalized at Daejeon ROK, Republic of Korea, military hospital. However, because of lack of antivenom, the man's life reached precarious stage, news of which was forwarded to the U.S. military command. After receipt of this information, despite being Sunday, Captain Wortmann immediately rushed to the ROK military hospital in Daejeon with 5 bottles of antivenom and saved the man's life that was nearing the point of death. Captain Wortmann has been known to be kind in treating the local residents. Such kindness offered by Captain Wortmann is highly spoken of by the local residents. Okay, the rest of the story. It's true that we got a call to take antivenom to 2 places. One was, they said, a child had been bitten and needed antivenom, and this Korean soldier. So we got in the Jeep and went to see the child who hadn't been bitten by a snake. It was just an attempt to rip off and get some antivenom because it was worth a lot of money if you had it. The Korean soldier, however, had been bitten, and his leg was profoundly swollen. It hemorrhaged and it looked pretty bad. So I said he indeed needs it. Now, antivenom is antibodies in horse serum. So before you can give it, you want to make sure the person isn't allergic to horse serum. To do that, you do a skin test where you take a small amount, like 1/10 of a cc, and inject it just under the skin. Some of you may have had old TB tests where they put a little bleb, put fluid in, create a bleb. That's what you do. And I did that. The problem was the needle they had was about a 16 gauge. Now, when you get a shot, flu shot, you get like a 25 gauge. It's really tiny. A 16 gauge is about big around. And so it's impossible to put it subcutaneously without bleeding. So I did the skin test with this and was taken off by the one doctor in the hospital that day, a psychiatrist, to have coffee. That was a special treat, that he got to have coffee because I was there. We had our coffee, we go back and walk in, look at the skin test, and there's a bruise and there's a little bump. And I said, well, his leg looks so bad. That's probably the bleeding that caused this problem. We hung the antivenom, went back to have another cup of coffee. Came back, this guy was hives all over. He was allergic to the horse serum. So we stopped the IV. They had very little steroid, but they had some. We gave it to him. And I left, not sure if I hadn't killed him. I guess the moral is sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, because that's what was in the paper. So he obviously lived, and I became a hero, even though I wasn't. So another thing that happened while I was there was the co-producers of the TV show, Gene Reynolds and Larry Gelbart, came to visit us. They spent 7 days. They did everything we did, from going to Rosie's Bar to in the operating room. They interviewed everybody and taped it. When we went back to Los Angeles, they had 22 hours of transcript, which transcribed went to 5 feet of stack of paper. So I can tell you something about every episode after year 2 in the TV show MASH, which went 11 years. And it was based on a book by Richard Hooker, whose real name is Richard Hornberger. He was a doctor in a MASH hospital during the Korean War. Curiously, he grew up across the street from my mother in a small town in the middle of Missouri. But after the military, he went and practiced in Maine. And if you remember, Hawkeye Pierce was from Maine. And he wrote this book about, fictional book about things that sort of or might have or could have or did happen during the Korean War. And I think it's a fascinating read. It's funny and irreverent, and especially at the beginning and at the end. But in the middle, there's a short bit which describes in vivid detail what it must have been like to be in a MASH hospital, doing surgery after surgery after surgery when there was a major offensive during the war. The TV show was based on this book. It was done by CBS as a filler. They had an empty half hour. They wanted a situation comedy and went to Gene Reynolds and Larry Gelbart and said, can you do something with this book? And it was only supposed to go for 1 year. And at the end of the first year, they realized they had a hit. And in the middle of the second year, they realized that they really had a hit, and they were running out of material. The book's only so long. So they came to visit us. And they had written our commanding officer, and he said, sure. He didn't tell the people in Seoul. So Reynolds and Gelbart land and go to headquarters in Seoul, and that was apparently quite an interesting situation, but they were allowed to come and spend a week with us. And on your right over here is Larry Gelbart. He was best known for writing A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. And Gene Reynolds was a childhood actor with Jackie Cooper, and he's on this side, again with Alan Alda. And so what effect did we have on the show? Well, I think one of the things that they learned from the visit that the MASH unit may be like camp for adults, but it's also a lot of serious things happen. In fact, there was no, if you see an episode of reruns and they're in the OR and there's no blood on their scrub suits, it was season 1 or 2. After that, there's blood. There were issues, well, Larry Gelbart wrote once, it was an amazing recharge for us to go to be able to do this research, to come back with the notes. When you actually go to the area and see a soldier without hands or feet lying in bed, you have something to mull over for a long, long while. And so there are something serious in almost every episode after year 2. In fact, some episodes were entirely serious. And one thing they learned was that a lot of injuries occurred from people trying to pick up brass after we would play war games and shoot off lots of artillery. And they'd go out to pick up the brass, and some of it would still be live. A lot of injuries that way. I mentioned the carbon monoxide poisoning that was in an episode. All our names were used as characters. You couldn't hear it. This is Colonel Wortmann. I don't know why that's not louder on this. I could hear it. Had it loud at home. No, that was Colonel Wortmann. This was General Iron Guts Kelly, who died in a hot lips hula hand tent with his boots on. And I was the only one that got promoted. All the other doctors' names were used, but they were all demoted. I felt good about that. Not that I wanted them demoted, but I felt they must have said something for me to get promoted. Oops. Also, there was an episode where Radar's collecting money for a baby pool. Colonel Potter's going to have a grandkid. And while they were over there, there was a baby pool in our little officers club for when our son was going to be born. And so my next last day, a bunch of things happened. So for a short period of time, I was the commanding officer. So I got to sit at the desk. And in reflection of my year in Korea, I think Richard Hooker Hornberger wrote in the preface to his book something that was pertinent to the physicians in Korea, but also to our little group of doctors. Said the doctors who worked at the Mobile Harmony Surgical Hospital were very young, perhaps too young, and undertrained to be doing what they were doing. The surgeons in the mass hospitals were exposed to extremes of hard work, leisure, tension, boredom, heat, cold, satisfaction, and frustration most had never faced before. Their actions was individually and collectively to cope with the situation, get the job done, and survive. So after Korea, I finished my Army tour at Fort Carson, Colorado, Home 7, State 7. In '75, we returned to Ann Arbor. I finished my residency, did a chief medical residency, served as chief medical resident, and then did a rheumatology fellowship. And Dottie, after the birth of our second son, finished her residency and did a pediatric rheumatology fellowship. And I also grew hair. It didn't last, though. In 1979, we moved to Milwaukee. I worked at the Medical College of Wisconsin. Dottie was actually the first pediatric rheumatologist in the state of Wisconsin. When she finished her training, she was one of only 100 people in that specialty in the country. Initially, I took care of patients, taught, and did research. At that time, I wanted to figure out why people who had inflammatory muscle disease experienced muscle weakness. I never figured it out, but I was on the right track and had the right hypothesis. But after a time, I got tapped on the shoulder to do more and more administrative tasks. And while in Milwaukee, I ended up co-chief of rheumatology, chief of medicine at the Milwaukee VA, and then interim chairman of the Department of Medicine. And I actually liked that last position, so when invited to look at jobs as chairman, I did. And, oops, before I go on that, while we were in Milwaukee, we started skiing once a year at Snowmass. There was a great meeting out there. We'd meet from 7 to 9 and 4:30 to 6:30 and ski in between. And we did that for many, many years. And at one of the first meetings, there was a picnic at noon at the bottom of the hill. And this picnic was a race. And you raced the blue course and the red course. Now, the slope of the course was about 1 degree. It had poles, so you had to go around, but you had a pole. You couldn't just, gravity wouldn't let you go down. So we raced each other, and I win the first run down. We start the second run down, and I look over and I say, dishes for the year. He said, okay. Not only did she beat me, 60 people raced, she came in second. So I still do the dishes, clean up afterwards, and she won't race me again. I also ran my first marathon, one of 7. This is finishing the New York City Marathon once. In 1992, we moved to Greenville, North Carolina, where I was chairman of the Department of Medicine there, and Dottie had to start another pediatric rheumatology program. In '99, we moved to Tulsa, where I served as chairman of the Department of Medicine at the University of Oklahoma. And in 2007, Dottie said that I finally came to my senses, and I decided I didn't want to be a department chair any longer. And we were offered and accepted jobs at the Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth. Anybody know who Theodore Geisel was? Dr. Seuss. The Dr. Seuss Medical School. And in 2013, we retired and we became snowbirds, bouncing between New Hampshire and here. And then a year ago, May, we moved to Tide Point. So I'll conclude quickly to talk a little bit about my art, which has become one of my greatest pleasures now. I always loved art as a youngster, and in fact, I was quite proud in the 3rd grade when my tempera painting of some Indians dancing around a campfire was selected for my school to represent my school at the Nelson Art Gallery in Kansas City. I stopped taking art classes after the 8th grade. You know, if you wanted to go to a good college, you didn't take art. You took something practical like Latin. I didn't do anything with art until 1985, and I tore a ligament in my knee at a YMCA soccer picnic. Well, we were about 2 days later to go to Cape Cod for a 2-week vacation. And so what was I going to do at Cape Cod with a cast from my hip to my ankle? I said, I'm going to paint. And I did. But when we got back home, having 2 little kids and both of us working, it just didn't work out. So I abandoned that thought for a while. In 1997, again because of an injury, this time I hurt my back really bad. I couldn't do much else. I said, I'm going to take up painting. And I did. And this time it stuck. And I started painting with oils. We moved to Tulsa, and I kept painting with oils until in 2002, I took a workshop in pastel. It was, one reason I took it was I'd never done anything with pastel before. I wanted to try it. Second reason was it was on a Saturday, and working full-time, I could take one on Saturday. And third, it was portraits, which I couldn't do portraits worth a darn. I said, well, I'd give it a try. And I just, it was my media. And I continued with that ever since. This last year, I've started teaching pastel painting at the Art League and here. And it's been very rewarding to be teaching again. Of all the things I did in my career, teaching was my favorite. And it's a different subject, but I've really enjoyed working with people who want to learn. I now have 74 paintings in 40 homes. And I do enjoy commissions, and my prices are reasonable. And you can talk to Bonnie Finch. So I'll just conclude showing you a few examples of my work. I like to paint things of nature. I actually saw one of these standing on a lagoon next to the health club this morning. I walked my dog. We went out at 7:30. We came back at 8:15. It was still there. I went over to go water walking at 9. That bird was still standing in the same place. That's patience. Here's the ocean scene. This is Bonnie's picture.
Is that a pastel?
That's pastel.
One I have.
So pastels are a dry medium, but the same pigments in pastels are the same pigments that are in oil paints. The difference is the pigment's mixed with oil in paint, and it's mixed with a dry medium for pastels. So the colors and the vibrancy and all are exactly the same. Some Arsine with a nice... And I also like to paint flowers. And we were sort of my first thing I took on, because I always reasoned there's a flower that looks like the one I painted somewhere. It may not look like the one I was painting.
It's hard to do.
And there you have it.